We're very happy to have Brother Harry Workman, or Gary Workman, with us today. I can't get a hold of this. I saw Johnny Ramsey out at Abilene one year, and I didn't know who he was. He looked like a walking Brillo pad. And it's so uncommon to see Gary in the same situation. But yeah. No, we're really glad to have Gary. We love him so much. To speak to us this hour, Gary is a native of California. Maybe that explains things. But he holds a BA in religion and biblical languages, did graduate work in the Middle Eastern religions, has preached for almost 30 years in California, Nevada, and Texas. He was deported from Beirut, Lebanon, where he was the dean of the Middle East Bible Training College, and I think that that's true, isn't it, Gary? Sometimes preaching the truth will get you in trouble, but that's all right. He's a former instructor of Bible and Greek at Preston Road School of Preaching in Dallas. Authored the book, Has That Which Is Perfect Come? Has contributed to many other books and is staff writer and prolific writer for many of our periodicals. Now resides in Mesquite, Texas, serves as editor of one of our better papers, The Restorer, the staff writer for the Firm Foundation, conducts gospel meetings and lectureships such as this. He's in great demand for lectureships. He and his wife, Sonny, who is also a very accomplished speaker, lecturer, musician, typesetter. The two of them put this book together, and they have 4 children and 2 grandchildren. I wish I had more time to talk about Gary, but I don't. But we are glad that he's here to speak to us at this hour on Thou Shalt Worship the Lord Thy God. Gary Workman.
No, I was not deported from Lebanon, but I'll tell you what, if you want real persecution, just grow some whiskers. When Dub McLeish heard that I had grown this, he talked to me on the telephone, and in a very serious tone of voice, he said, "You know that's the first sign of liberalism, don't you?" I tell you what, I hope that all of you will join me in praying that Eddie Whitten will have a better sense of humor. I thought he was an easygoing, gentle sort of a fellow until I talked to him on the phone just recently, about 10 days ago or so, and maybe a week ago, and I said, I have bad news for you. The book won't be ready until after the lectureship is over. And I said, after he realized I was just kidding, I said, I hope I didn't take any years off your life. And he said, no, but I was just ready to take some off of yours. And last year, I tried the same thing. I called him up and I said, I have bad news and good news. The bad news is that the book won't be ready till the end of January. And he said, well, I have bad news for you. You're dead. And then I came walking in here on Monday morning, and he took one look at my face, and he said, which lectureship are you speaking on? It's not this one. So I hope that maybe somehow between all of us we could work on him a little bit, get him into an easier frame of mind. It certainly is a pleasure to be with you and to have a part in this program. It always is whenever I have had this opportunity. Today's assignment for me is one that is just as challenging as any other that I have had the privilege in having a part in. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God. You recognize that from Matthew 4, verse 10, and the rest of the statement is, and him only shalt thou serve. And so that one statement from Jesus brings up the subject of worship, and it brings up the subject of service. From the statement of Jesus, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, we understand some things. We understand that worship is a matter of obligation. We not only have the option and privilege of worship, but we also have the obligation of worship. It should be that every Christian sincerely, wholeheartedly desires and loves to worship God, but even if that were not the case, God still would expect worship anyway. It is a requirement from his part to ours. So it's important to know what worship is, and it's equally important to know how to do it acceptably. Worship is something that everybody knows about or has at least heard about, but very few, I'm convinced, have really studied about it. The subject is approached more often, I think, by intuition than by investigation. And in other words, the Bible simply has not been consulted very deeply on some aspects of the subject of worship. Now, many books have been written on it. Many lessons have been taught on it, but very few have begun to scratch the surface as to what worship is all about, everything that is involved in it. And as I think of the subject, it seems to me that it easily resolves itself into about three categories. Number one is, what is the meaning of worship? Number two is, what are the avenues and attitudes by which worship is to be done? And then number three is, how can worship be improved or deepened or strengthened or made more spiritual? It seems to me that a lot has been written on number two of that list of three, and especially a lot has been written on the third one. But very little has been written on the first one. And it's for this reason that I've chosen to devote the bulk of my time just now to the subject of what is the meaning of worship. Now, there are various ideas about worship that are floating around, and I have read a number of books, articles, and various treatments of the subject of worship, Bible dictionaries, entire volumes on the subject, and just every kind of a treatment that is imaginable. And from those, I jotted down definitions, so-called, of worship that people came up with. I won't give them all to you. I listed a few of them in the book. But all of those can be summarized, I think, under four main things. Number one, here are different ideas now that people have had regarding worship. Number one, a spiritual awareness of God. In other words, it's just a mental awareness or a spiritual awareness. The fact that you're aware that God is up there, that he's watching you, that he can see you. Number two would be an adoration or reverence toward God. And so that goes beyond the awareness to something a little more overt. And then number three, a group of special activities, usually listed as 5 in number, by which or through which we may honor God. And then number 4 would be living one's entire life in God's service. Now, in recent years, that number 4 idea has grown to be more popular. There has been a trend developing in which different ones in recent times have been known to say that worship and service are identical. And some have attempted to set that forth, to maintain that with vigor. I give the credit to Brother Irvin Bishop for really starting this ball rolling about 12 years ago or so in a series of articles, a series of 6 articles, which appeared in the Firm Foundation under the heading, The Christian Assembly. And in this, Brother Bishop set forth this idea that worship and service are equated, that worship is service and service is worship. In other words, all service is worship, not just some. I want to read to you just 2 or 3 little excerpts from what he said, and I've brought along some copies of these articles and others. He said in that first installment that one of the most basic presuppositions that we share with others in all branches of Christendom involves the very nature of worship, what it is, where and when it takes place. We have retained an inherited concept of worship that is more Jewish than Christian. In his second installment, he said that worship in the New Age is not to be associated merely with special acts limited by place or time, but rather encompasses the whole of the true worshiper's relationship and service to God. It is a testimony to the unity of the New Testament that the words for worship, notice this now, it's important, although borrowed from Jewish and pagan contexts of formal ceremonial temple worship, whenever applied to Christians, refer without exception not to a worship service, but to a life of service. Back in the first installment, he had said something along that line also. What answers to the temple in the New Testament is not the church building, but the church, the body of Christ. What corresponds to the temple ceremony is not a Christian worship service. And so Brother Bishop sort of introduced the topic in terms like that, and then examined a lot of New Testament terminology that pertained to the subject of worship. Another brother, Lindsey Garman by name, who preaches in the Corpus Christi area, came along some years later, took up where Brother Bishop began, and expounded the same sort of thing in some oral sermons delivered there in the pulpit where he preaches. He said, we think in terms of certain acts of worship, and we've called them avenues of worship. He said we've just kind of focused in on a place and a time for worship. He said I was always led to focus in on the Lord's Supper, the giving, the singing, the praying, and the studying of the Bible, and these were called avenues or acts of worship. He said we need to get back into the New Testament and see that the New Testament teaches a beautiful concept of worship that goes far, far beyond what we do in this building. And it goes far, far beyond what we do through 5 avenues of worship. And this sort of thing is the representative of the thinking that has come along in recent times. I don't know that anybody has tried to maintain this position any more vigorously than these two men, but they have really spent some effort in trying to set forth that position. Brother Garman went ahead to say that the worship terminology of the New Testament is applied to all areas of ministry and service. And he explained it like this. He said, you see, wherever you are, there is a temple because Christians are temples of God. You're the temple of God, and wherever you are, there's a priest on the scene because you are a royal priest of God. Now, wherever you have that combination, a temple where God is present and where there's a priest on the scene, not only can worship occur, but when you have that combination, worship must occur. Not only can it, but it must. And what he's saying is that by virtue of the very fact that you are a Christian in the body of Christ, which is the temple of the living God, that means that everything you do is worship. Everything. Now, Brother Jim McGuigan wrote a commentary on Romans, and I have thought in many instances in that volume that he did a very, very fine job. I appreciate so much what he did in Romans chapter 4, for example, and the grace law controversy, and setting that forth rightly. But I think he made a serious blunder in chapter 12. And in that section, when he got into explaining Romans 12:1 about your reasonable service, or as some are wont to translate it, your spiritual worship, presenting your body a living sacrifice, he said worship is as broad as the Christian life. He said the man who lawfully offers to God what pleases God is worshiping God. He went on to say, involved in that life of worship is paying debts, providing for one's family, doing good. In fact, he even went so far as to say that playing golf is worship, brushing one's teeth, washing one's hands, and the like is worship. He said, I don't see any difficulty in getting it into worship. He said, worship is the conscious giving to God in a pleasing way that which is pleasing to Him. Now notice this statement that ties in with that one that I just made. It is pleasing to God for a group of saints in social merriment to beat the brains out of a piano, to the tune, "Show Me the Way to Go Home," isn't it? He said if the saint can pleasingly offer the activity to the Lord, he is worshiping the Lord. Well, I seem to recall that little song from years and years ago, and I think one phrase in it says, "I had a little drink about an hour ago," and it went right through my head. I don't know that that'd be very pleasing to the Lord in the first place. But in the second place, I deny adamantly that anything like that, singing "Home, Home on the Range" or "Three Blind Mice" or whatever song you may come up with in the secular realm, I deny that that is worship. And I don't believe that this position can be sustained at all. These are just some of the men that have set forth this position. Here's another man. Dick Marcier wrote a bulletin article. He said the New Testament uses 15 different words. Now these other fellows, Brother Garman and Bishop especially, said there are 5 different words for worship. But Brother Marcier said there are 15 different words that it translates worship, and really what he was doing was taking the 5 word groups and expanding them throughout their cognates or related words, taking both nouns and verbs and so forth, and came up with the 15 that way. And so he said 15 different words that it translates worship. Well, in the first place, the New Testament does not translate anything. Did you notice the statement? The New Testament uses 15 different words that it translates worship. No, men did the translating. I'm sorry, Paul didn't do that. Peter didn't do that. Men did the translating. Men can also be wrong in translating certain things. And so then he goes on to say, but not any of these are ever applied to the assembly of the church. I wonder, he says, why do we call our meetings on Sunday worship? Could it be that much of our thinking has been influenced by Judaism or by tradition? We sometimes speak of our buildings as if they were holy. Or, he says, as if they were the place God dwelt. That, of course, is Jewish. In the New Testament, we are told that God does not dwell in temples made by hands. He said, we are the temple of God. And then he said this, real worship is not something done in a building. He didn't say only in a building. He said not something done in a building. But rather the giving of our lives as living sacrifices, which Paul says is our spiritual worship. Now that's not King James translation of Romans 12 verse 1, which he identified as the text. Nor is it the American Standard, by the way. Our assemblies prepare us for worship. We assemble to be strengthened and edified. He got into a little bit of trouble with that article and tried to explain it a little further in a subsequent article, but still the point was made and kept that all of life is worship. These are just some of the things. Did you notice, I'm sure that most of you who receive church mail, those of you who are preachers, perhaps elders, have been getting the paper One Body sent out by Brother Don DeWelt. Did you notice that when he answered Guy N. Wood's, Brother Wood's article that appeared in the Gospel Advocate some time back, which itself was an answer to something that DeWelt had written, one of the points that DeWelt made is this. He said, all of life is an expression of worship. Did Jesus worship as he worked in the carpenter shop, or did he have to wait until Saturday? All of life is an expression of worship. And so you have these ideas, and some of these play into the hands of doctrinal error of men who cannot sort out the difference between the secular and the sacred and think that they are one and the same. It is not true that all of a Christian's life is service to God in the first place. And moreover, it is not true that all service is worship. The Bible carefully distinguishes between worship and service. All worship is service, but not all service is worship. The one term is far, far broader than the other. Now let's look at some of the Bible words for worship. And I think that part of the problem in this whole thing is that people simply do not let the Bible define its own terms. They are inclined to want to come to the Bible with certain presuppositions and then read that into the Bible. You know, that would be about like taking the English word church, looking it up in Webster's dictionary, and reading that it is maybe, number one, a body of religious people denominated by some name. Number two, a building where such people meet. And then taking those definitions and say, you see, the word church means both a people and a building. And reading that back into the New Testament and trying to maintain that the New Testament teaches that. And of course, we understand that would be wrong. By the same token, you cannot take the English word worship, which means to ascribe worth to something, and men have been called your worship, especially over in Great Britain in law courts. We say your honor over here. And take that kind of a term and read that back into the New Testament and say, therefore, I'm going to start with the English term and then I'm going to make the Bible's terminology fit the English. That's not the way to go about it. That's just the opposite. What we really need to do is go first to the Bible and say what kind of concepts are presented here and what kind of terms are used to explain those concepts, and then try to find an adequate English word to represent it. And that's the only way to go about it. So when we go to the Old Testament, for example, we find the term hishtahawa. Now, if you've lived over in the Middle East for a while, such as I have, you can get that gargle out a little bit and get that sound in there, sort of like the German CH. But hishtahawa comes from, some have said, the root word shacha. You'll see it represented that way most of the time in reference works, but now latest scholarship is saying that's wrong. It's really from the word kawa, not shacha in the first place. Well, at any rate, the form of the word comes out as hishtahawa. That's the form that is used that means worship, and it means to bow down, to prostrate oneself, that is to lie face down on the ground, so to speak, or to worship. So to bow down, prostrate oneself, or to worship. And we have this coming to us in certain passages of the Bible, where we can see it mentioned over and over again. For example, in Exodus 34 and verse 14, you read here God's statement, "Thou shalt worship no other God." And the explanation is given, for Jehovah, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Thou shalt worship no other God. Now, this statement, this same type of statement, was made in other places where a distinction was drawn between worship and service. Going to the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20 and chapter 5, where God forbade the making of any graven image. He said, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself unto them, nor serve them." There's the distinction between worship and service. And from this, we could go to many passages in the Old Testament and some in the New as well, where there is a similar distinction between worship and service. On pages 278 and 279 of the Lectureship book, I've listed out 20 passages in a column there, where you have that distinction drawn carefully over and over and over again, saying, don't worship them or serve them. And because of this insistence over and over again, we come to understand that there is a distinction between worship and service. That's why the double expression is used so many times. In fact, we may say this, there is a distinction between the worship of people's worship, and their performance of religious duties. Some of these things are brought out in various passages of the Old Testament. We won't have time to read them just now, but 2 Kings 17, verse 35 and 36, draws a distinction between worship and sacrifice. There's a distinction between worship and the first fruits in Deuteronomy 26 and verse 10. There's a distinction between worship and the offering of incense in 1 Chronicles 32 and verse 12. We need to go and do deeper study, more careful study in the Scriptures themselves and say, what do these passages tell us? These distinctions exist, and we must notice them. And then beyond that first word, that primary term, hishtachawa, for worship, there is the word sagad, or the Aramaic form of it, which is segid, found especially in the book of Daniel. That means the same as the other word. There's no essential difference in the meaning. It means to prostrate oneself in worship. And in all of these instances, in all of these Old Testament instances, there is the bowing or the prostrating of oneself denoting an overt act. It's an actual act. It's something that somebody stopped and did at some time and place. And it implies and involves a mental bowing down as well, a mental or spiritual submission to the will of God, a bending of one's mind to God's will and way. When it comes to the New Testament, we find the Greek word, the primary Greek term for worship is proskuneo. Proskuneo, from the Greek word pros, meaning to or toward, and kuneo, meaning to kiss. And so the two put together means to kiss toward. And so the idea is that you kiss the hand or the feet or the ground in front of the one who is being worshiped. Or in some cases you throw a kiss to the deity that is being worshiped. And so the idea is expressed again in an overt act. 59 times this word is found in the New Testament, and the King James and the American Standard translations render it worship every single time. And so we understand there's no dispute about these words that we have mentioned thus far. The hishtachava in the Old Testament, along with that rarer word sagad, and the proskuneo in the New Testament, there is no dispute about these words. Everyone agrees that these words mean worship. This word, proskuneo, corresponds to the Old Testament terms that we've already noticed. And therefore, that's why it is the primary term. This is what Satan asked of Jesus. He said, if you will fall down and worship me. Now that's an overt act. Fall down and worship me. And Jesus said, it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God. And that's the word that Jesus used by way of reply, and drew a distinction between worship and service when he said, and him only shalt thou serve. The New Testament speaks of wrongly offering such worship to Satan, his allies, idols, even God's messengers, like an apostle or an angel, could not receive the worship of men, and men were forbidden to offer worship to them. Then you have other Greek words that come up more infrequently than this particular one that we've noticed. For example, the sebomai Greek word and its cognates, sebadzomai, sebasma, eusebeo, those four terms especially. Sebadzomai is found in Romans 1:25, where Paul said they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. Did you notice also there the distinction between worship on the one hand and service on the other? And then you have threskeia and ethelo-threskeia, a compound translated worshiping and will worship, especially in the book of Colossians. And that completes the New Testament and Old Testament vocabulary on worship. This idea of so many words representing worship is just entirely not correct. Let's look at Bible words for service. Here's where the confusion comes in. A basic mistake is made here, and that is to assume that anything done in the Old Testament tabernacle or temple was worship, and then transferring those words, describing those functions into a New Testament context and seeing how they're used in the New Testament and saying, oh, okay, they were worship back here, therefore they must be worship over here as well. There are two mistakes made there, and the main mistake is that the Old Testament did not describe tabernacle ritual as worship. It's not described that way. Look it up. You won't find hishtachava in connection with tabernacle or temple ritual, ceremony offered by priests and Levites in the temple or tabernacle. Won't be found there. The Greek word and the Hebrew word for worship are not used in connection with that. And so here's where people get off on the wrong foot, and they decide by means of improper assumptions in the first place and then improper comparisons perhaps in the second place, and they come up by means of those two fallacies with incorrect ideas about worship. Now, worship is an involved subject. It's not a simple one. In fact, it is something that involves a lot of study. There is a difficulty in defining worship. We must understand that. One writer, one of our brethren, said it is not easy to put a definition of worship into words. So vast is the concept of worship. No definition seems adequate. Another man, not our brethren, said the term worship, like many other Greek words such as grace and love, defies adequate definition. It is more easily experienced than described. Another one said truly worship is one of the more vague areas in the minds of many Christians. Another one, this is from the New Bible Dictionary, said, so far as the New Testament is concerned, our notions of Christian worship are very vague. You see, there is a problem, and those who are honest admit that it is an involved subject. And because of this, we want to be careful not to oversimplify the matter, but I'm going to contend that a lot of the vagueness and confusion arises because of a failure to let the Bible define its own terms. And so, if we go back to the Bible, look again now. What are the words for service? Well, you have in the Old Testament sharat, and you have Lectureship in the New. Sharat in the Old refers in particular to the ritualistic duties of the priests and the Levites in the tabernacle or temple. It is usually rendered minister in the King James Version, or serve, in other words. Minister or serve. It is a type of service. It is a ritualistic, ceremonial type of service. It is never rendered worship. Exodus 28:35 would be a passage in the Old Testament. Or Exodus 33 and verse 10 as a contrast to that. Whereas the priests and the Levites offered this service or ministered in the temple, all the people worshiped, each man at his tent door in Exodus 33 and verse 10. Worship was done by all the people. This type of ceremonial service was done by only a few. We need to notice Numbers chapter 16 and verse 9, because here is an important passage in understanding just exactly what the significance of the word sharat in the Old Testament really is. Notice this, where God said, number 16, verse 9, he said, the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel. Speaking now to the priests and the sons of Levi. And he says, to bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of Jehovah, and to stand before the congregation to minister unto them. That word minister is the Hebrew word sharat. Minister to who? Unto them. In other words, the people were being served. The people were being ministered to. Do you worship people? That shows the distinction between worship and service. You worship only God. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. When it comes to worship, when it comes to service, you serve the people as well. There's the distinction between worship and service brought out in that particular word. And then you have the word Lectureship. Comes from the Greek word laos, meaning people, and the word ergon, meaning work. And you have, therefore, the work for the people. You have public service, in other words, and this word is used exclusively to describe priestly ritual. It's found in the Septuagint many times, and it describes that priestly ritual. It is the ordinary Greek term translating sharat that we just noticed. We need to also look here now at another term in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, and in verse 3, notice this. And he said unto the Levites that taught all Israel, that were holy unto Jehovah, put the holy ark in the house which Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, did build. There shall be no more a burden upon your shoulders. Now serve Jehovah your God and his people Israel. Serve God and his people Israel. Does this word mean worship? If so, then it's saying worship God and his people Israel. And if this word means worship, then you would have Moses telling the Levites and other inspired writers telling the people of God that they were to worship the people. Taking both of these passages together, Numbers 16:9 and 2 Chronicles 35:3. But the 15 times in the New Testament, the word is never rendered as worship. The priest stood ministering, we read in Hebrews 10 and verse 11. Jesus Christ had a better ministry. He was the minister of a new covenant. All of these things pertaining to the ministry. Romans 15:16, Paul ministered as a ministering servant of the Lord and offered converts up as if they were sacrifices. And so the word comes into the New Testament as the idea of performing a religious ritual, just like the priests did in the tabernacle, but now it is preaching the gospel and making converts. That is not worship, that is service, just as the work of the priests was service, not worship. But now two other words, abad and latruo. Abad in the Old is the primary word for service in the Old Testament, the noun abodah. And the basic meaning of it was just simply to work or serve. It was directed toward the people and God. Service may include worship, but it is broader than worship. And so this word was used of service by the priests and by the people as well. Latruo is the corresponding term in the Greek, and it comes from a word meaning to work. Latron is the word for wages. Latris is a hireling or a servant, and so therefore it simply meant to work for wages. And then it came to mean to work in general, whether there were wages involved or not. Now, this is the word that is used in Numbers 16, verse 9, where you serve the people. Latruo, the people, in the Septuagint translation. Does it mean worship? If so, the people are being worshiped. No, it doesn't. What happened when somebody tried to worship a man? Peter said, stand up, I myself am a man, Acts 10:25. The angel said, don't worship me, worship God, when John the Apostle fell at his feet in Revelation chapter 19 and also 22. So if latruo, the word for service in the New Testament, the primary word for service, means worship, then it is just like proskuneo, the ordinary word for worship. And Numbers 16:9 will therefore have Moses telling the Levites to worship the people, which were human beings. You know, one can be misled by reference works, including lexicons. No lexicon is perfect. No commentary is perfect. My friend Johnny has been heard to say the Bible sheds a lot of light on these commentaries. And sometimes that's true. Lexicons can make mistakes. The ultimate court of appeal is not what a lexicographer concludes, but rather what the Bible passages reveal as to the meaning of a word. And sometimes they don't do their homework as carefully as they ought. And that's why they contradict each other sometimes and disagree with one another. And so we need to come back to the Bible passages themselves and see how these things are represented. And many have been unduly influenced by the development of the modern day liturgy from the word liturgia, and have let that service for the people develop into a liturgy of modern denominationalism or Catholicism, and then read that concept back into the Bible. That should not be. The New Testament maintains a distinction between worship and service. Paul said he went to worship at Jerusalem, Acts 24 and verse 11, but he was serving God night and day, Acts 26 and verse 7. And he referred to the heathen, again, as we mentioned before, who worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. Now, you have in this word service the idea that, especially in connection with Romans 12 and verse 1, that worship and service are identical. Some have said this is the prime passage for worship in the New Testament. Irvin Bishop said that it serves as the best definition of Christian worship. Lindsey Garman said it may be the most significant passage for a clear and adequate understanding of Christian worship. But this verse does not speak of a life of constant worship. The subject is sanctification, and Paul is simply expanding on a point that he had made earlier in chapter 6. Some of his readers were not fully converted. They went through the form of conversion, possibly with some degree of faith, but without a full consecration. They were inclined to continue in sin that grace may abound, as Paul represented in Romans 6 verse 1. And therefore Paul said in verse 6 of that chapter, knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away, that we should no longer be in bondage to sin. And then he said in verses 12 and 13, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey the lusts thereof. Neither present your members unto sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves unto God as alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. He said, you are under grace. You are not under law. And therefore, the second part of verse 19, present your members as servants to righteousness unto sanctification. This is the subject, the very same subject that Paul is on in Romans 12, verse 1. And because of all of this discussion that he had written before, he ties it into this chapter 12 by saying, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies, in other words, the grace of God that he'd already been writing on, to present, same word as back in chapter 6, your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Not spiritual service. It's logikon, reasonable, not pneumatikon. Your reasonable service, not worship, but service. And both here in Romans 12:1 and in Romans 6 and verse 13, the verbs are aorist, a one-time point action. Turn yourselves over to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves. Dedicate yourselves. Come to the Lord and be converted. This is the idea that is being expressed by Paul in this particular passage. Much more we need to say on the subject of worship, but time fails us. I hope you will read the chapter in the book, for much more is presented there as to what constitutes worship, whether it was revolutionized in the Christian age by Jesus' statement to the Samaritan woman, or whether he simply eliminated the holy place, and what constitutes the acts of worship for us today. I thank you so much for your attention.
I wish I could talk that fast without running my words together. That was a powerful sermon on the difference between worship and service, and it's deeply, deeply appreciated and needed. Wish we had more time. Gary took my time, so I'll have to take some of Johnny's or Bill's. But we do appreciate so much that presentation.